Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. In this tutorial we will wear the sprinkle sweater. It's a sweater that for what we are using the round yoke technique, and I will explain right away how I calculate the stitches, the increases when I need um, to make a round yoke. So if you want to do that, you will need to start with a swatch, a gauge swatch, and see how many stitches and how many rows you have in a square of 10 per 10 centimeters or 4 per 4 inches. Then you'll need to calculate the number of stitches that you'll need for the neckline. This of course is depending on if you're adding a ribbing or not adding a ribbing, and of course you need to have as a reference the head circumference because we need to be able to put on the pullover. So I calculated in total 48 stitches because I made a ribbing neckline which shrinks the neckline circumference pretty much, especially because I'm using a smaller crochet hook. Then we will need to calculate the number of stitches that we will need at the end of the yoke, and this will mean bust plus sleeve circumference. Now, to calculate bust, you can either measure your bust and sleeves upper arm, or you can measure a sweater that you like how the fit and how this stays on you. For example, I calculated, I have my bust circumference is 86 centimeter, and I added a positive ease for the sweater, so I needed 100 centimeters for the bust. Then for the sleeves I have 26 centimeters the upper arm, and I went up to 34 centimeters. If you're calculating and measuring a sweater is easier for you because in this way you don't need to adjust the ease, but this is how I calculated everything. Now, according with your gauge swatch, you can now transform all these numbers, all these centimeters into stitches. So knowing how many stitches you have for 10 centimeters, it will be easier to calculate how many stitches you will need. So I have here for the yoke, I need 168 centimeters, and I need to transform that into stitches. Now, on the yoke, raglan, whatever, to have a great fit, you need to add some armpit chains. So this will need the number of stitches that you need to add for the armpit, or you want to add for the armpit, needs to be deducted from the total number of stitches that you need for the yoke, for your bust circumference and sleeve circumference, because you will be adding them after finishing the yoke, so on the dividing round, and having those extra stitches you don't need them in plus when finishing the yoke. So for this particular design I added 3 stitches on each armpit. This means that I need to deduct from the subtract from the sleeve circumference, and from the bust circumference I need um, to subtract 6 stitches. So now the end result here is 120 stitches that I need for the yoke. Now we will need to calculate the yoke depth, and this is really simple. Usually I'm using as reference the armhole depth, and on the yoke I'm adding between 2-4 centimeters depending on the fit of the sweater. This time I added 2 centimeters, so I need 20 centimeters for the yoke depth, which equals with 21 rows according to my gauge. Now I know how many stitches I need to start with. I know how many stitches I need for at the end of the yoke, and I know how many rows I need to work. So now we will calculate how we are doing the increases. So we need to calculate how many stitches we need to add. So from the total number of stitches of the yoke, subtract the number of stitches of the neckline, and you will have the number of stitches that you will need to add along the yoke. This number of stitches, you need to divide the number of stitches by the number of rows that you need to work for the yoke, and then you will have a result, a number of stitches that you'll need to add per row. But in case you don't want to increase at every row, and this is the same thing that I did with this particular design, then you can group the total number of rows into group of rows. For example, in this particular design I increased at every 2 rows. So I increase 1 row, then working 2 rows without increasing. So I'm dividing the total number of stitches that I need to increase, or the total number of rows first, to see how many groups of rows we have. So I divided it by 3 and I end up with 7 groups of rows. And then again, we're doing the total number of stitches that we need to add and divide them to the group of rows that we have, and then we know with how many stitches we need to increase at every 3 rows. So having that, of course, you can then adjust it to the number of stitches that you start with, because if you want to work per segment or in sections, then you will have to work with multiple of something. So I'm starting with 48 stitches, and for the size small, which I'm doing it in this tutorial, I will work in multiple of 12. So I decided to increase with 12 stitches at every 3 rows, and then I will adjust along with the end of the yoke, maybe working a few rows without increases in case when I'm finishing and I have the number of stitches that I need. Now to talk about the yarn that I'm using is Katia Azulejo. The brand is saying that this yarn is in category 4, but it's because it's lightweight than the actual thickness of the yarn, because this is two-stranded yarn. And we will use a 10mm crochet hook because we will work in center single crochet or waistcoat stitch. And if you don't want to have that thick fabric or stiff fabric, it's better to work it with a bigger crochet hook. So now we will start with a foundation chain, and as I said is 48 centimeters. We will add a ribbing at the neckline at the end. So in case you want, you can just simply work the ribbing first with a number of rows for the ribbing that you'll need to for the neckline. Then I will work the first row. You can either join the chains, the ends, to make a circle from the beginning, or simply work the first row to make sure that it's not twisted, and then you can go and work in a round. The first row will be worked in a regular single crochet, so you will need to work 1 single crochet into each stitch. Then we will join with a slip stitch to make the circle after finishing this first row. But again, if you want, you can do the joining after finishing the foundation chain. And for the second row, we will start working the centered single crochet. For this stitch, you have to insert the hook between those 2 bars that forms the V of the single crochet. so through the center of the stitch. That's why it's also called a centered single crochet. On the first row it will be a bit difficult to insert the hook, and what is the trick with this stitch pattern to work it easy is to keep your tension looser. So work the stitches as looser as possible, because if you have a looser stitch, then it will be easier to insert the hook through that middle of the stitch on the next row. The second row will be in center single crochet, and it's not an increasing round. As we said, we will work 2 plus 1, so 2 rows without making increases and 1 row with increasing. So on the second row we will work 1 center single crochet into each stitch around. Okay, after finishing the first 2 stitches, I will show you how to make the invisible slip stitch at the end. So pull out the hook and insert the hook into the last stitch from back to front, then grab the working loop and pull it through. And when you start to work the first stitch, you don't need to chain 1, you simply go and work the first stitch. The third row is an increasing row, and as I said at the beginning, I divided the yoke into 12 sections. So 48 divided by 12 means 4 stitches. This means that I will have 1 increase, so 2 center single crochet into the first stitch, and then 1 center single crochet into the next 3 stitches. On every group of rows I will increase with the same amount of stitches, meaning 12, but as I showed you into the calculation before, you don't need to keep the same number of stitches with every increase row. Now in the next frame, because we won't work together the yoke, you will see a photo with yoke pattern. Be free to just screenshot this section to just be able to follow the pattern to finish the yoke, or simply pause this video and follow along row by row. Again, this pattern is according to my gauge and is for size small, and in case you want to check the pattern for other sizes, this pattern is available on my website, and I will let the link into the description below, where you can find the pattern for multiple sizes up to 5 extra large. So now let's just work the yoke. Again, when you see an increase, you need to do 2 center single crochet into same stitch, and the section when it's in a star at the beginning, you need to repeat it 12 times. Okay, so I finished 21 rows for the yoke, and now we are about to divide the yoke into sleeves and body, and we will have 37 stitches for back and front panel and 23 stitches for sleeves. We will start with the back panel stitches. So right from where our yarn is, we will work 37 stitches. And after finishing 37 stitches, we will chain 3, which are the armpit stitches. Then we will skip 23 stitches that we have for the sleeve, and going into the 24th stitch and start working the front panel stitches, which will be also 37. And we will work the 37 stitches for the front panel, and then we will chain 3, skip the second sleeve stitches, and join with that invisible slip stitch to close the round. Okay, so now we will chain 3 for the armpit stitches, and then we will skip the second sleeve stitches. You should have by the end of the row also 23 stitches as on the other sleeve, and we will slip stitch to close the round. I have a bit of trouble with inserting the hook into this first stitch. That's why it's important to keep the tension looser, because you won't have this kind of issues. But if it's happening, don't worry, it's not like every stitch will be in this way. So now that we finished the separating round, we can now work on the length of the sweater, and we will work in total 25 rows for the length. This, if in case you want longer, the sweater to be longer, then of course you can work more rows. I just want wanted waist length sweater this time, but of course in case you want it longer, you simply need to work more rows until you will get to the desired length. So this is with the separating row, and of course after finishing the length we will meet again to see what it's to be done next. So now I will just continue working on the length of the sweater. Okay, so I finished 25 rows for the length, and now I will switch the crochet hook to a smaller one, to a smaller size. I'm using 8mm crochet hook for the ribbing, but you can use the same crochet hook as the rest of the sweater. I just wanted the ribbing to be smaller as the rest of the sweater without having to do some decreasing. So now the ribbing is where we will work the same ribbing on the bottom of the sweater and the cuffs, and also around the neckline. That's why I was saying that you need to have this in mind when calculating the neckline stitches, because adding a ribbing, and if it's worked in a stitch pattern like this one, because we will work it when slip stitches in back loop only, Then you will need to have more space, because after the ribbing it will be smaller. Okay, so now let's work the ribbing, because it will be the same on the neckline and on the sleeves, and we want to repeat the pattern again. So after chaining 7, because this was the width for the ribbing that I wanted, we will slip stitch, turn and slip stitch, starting with the second stitch into each stitch. Then when we are getting to the sweater edge, you will need to slip stitch into the next 2 stitches of the sweater edge. And when you're making the slip stitch into the sweater, we are doing into the center as well, the center of the stitch, so not under the loops. Then we will turn and we will slip stitch into the back loop only, but into the last stitch. This is how I love to keep the edge of the ribbing, working the last stitch through both loops, but you can work it in one single loop into the back loop as well if you find it easier this way. Then we will chain 1 and turn, and we will slip stitch into the first stitch through both loops, and then into the next stitches only into the back loop. And when we're getting to the sweater edge, we will connect this ribbing row with 2 slip stitches into the next 2 stitches of the sweater. And then we will repeat these 2 rows until we will finish the entire sweater. And after finishing the entire sweater circumference, you can join the edges of the ribbing also with slip stitches. Okay, so now we will repeat these 2 rows until completing the bottom hem, and this is how it's looking. And now we will jump into the sleeve. I already worked the first sleeve. This sleeve is worked also in the round, the same as the trunk of the sweater. We are not doing any decreases along the sleeve, so simply work the stitches, the center single crochet into the same stitch. So we will start in one stitch into the middle stitch at the armpits and rejoin the yarn. And then we will do the center single crochet, and when the sleeve stitches are meeting the trunk stitches, here always I like to work 2 stitches together because I don't want to add extra stitches on the sleeve. But in case you find it difficult, or there is no point for you to have these 2 stitches together, then you can simply work around, and if you want to avoid a gap, you can simply work into that side stitch that you will see at the between the stitches of the sleeve and the stitches of the trunk. You can simply work 1 extra stitch. Is one stitch into each side, because we have um, two two stitches where we can do that. But it's okay, it's not like it's the end of the world. So wherever you find it easier for you, either those two stitches together or working every single stitch, then it's totally fine. And then we will continue to work center single crochet into each stitch around until we will have in total 32 rows, or until you will get to the desired length. And after finishing the sleeve length, we will add the ribbing in the same way as we did for the bottom hem, and also we will add the same ribbing pattern for the neckline. And after finishing everything, you simply need to wave in all ends and wear the sweater with pleasure. So this was it for this today's tutorial. Thank you for watching and see you next time.